Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. And again, thank you for making the time. I want to start my presentation, Upstream Demand, Critical Minerals, and the Electrification Economy with a picture. So, a few months ago, I was standing on a reclaimed mine site that is an active mining site as well in New Mexico, right after looking at this tailings pond that you see. Um, and right after I saw this tailings pond, I stared at a tailings pile that had been sitting there since before most of the people in this room were born, including myself. And so, somewhere between that pile and the electrification build out happening across the country right now is a supply chain that neither industry, and by industry, I mean both materials, processing, mining, energy infrastructure, energy efficiency, that we're fully tracking. And it's such a large task. And I think right now, with all of the federal news and shifts that we're seeing about the promotion of onshoring domestic supply chains, more conversations about electrification and renewable energy and transmission build out, et cetera, are being discussed on the mining and other extractive industry side. So the electrification side um, needs to also think more about where we are getting our ore from, where we're getting our materials from. And I have been increasingly spending my time in that gap between the two sectors. And that gap is what today's talk is going to actually be about. So the photo that I'm featured in was taken at New Mexico's largest porphyry of the copper mine. And I don't know if all of us know, but copper truly shaped the American grid, and the tailings pond of Chino, right in front of here, is where that full Tyrone and Chino is where that full weight of that fact becomes visible, which is a flat sheet of teal cut into the surrounding waste rocks, dull silver, vast in a way that is truly indescribable. And I think I'm saying this and I'm showing these photos to say that the energy transition will need more, the initiatives that we're pushing will need more of what this ground produced. And the question is whether we have learned anything from what we've left behind. And I am work a lot in the energy governance side of that. So my professional frame for that time spent in the Southwest, New Mexico, and a few other states was specific. The relationship between the materials, the electrification economy demands, and then the governance frameworks that will determine how these materials are extracted, how they're managed, and how they're eventually closed. And that right there is an environmental justice topic as well. And so the American West has been answering these versions, at least, of these questions for quite some time now, and the answers have not always been adequate to the scale of that asking. So all in all, hello everyone. My name is McKenna Dunbar. I'm principal of the Grid Foundry, and I also direct the research arm, which is the American Energy Security Laboratory. And so um, the rest of the presentation, here's the argument in one line. The thing standing between us and an unfinished electrification project isn't necessarily a shortage of what minerals are in the ground, but it's usually what happens to those minerals after they come out of it. And almost nobody in both of the demand side or the supply side is having a look at that step closely. And so I'm not only working, but also I'm in a wonderful grad school program at Western Colorado University, a master's in environmental management with a concentration in mine reclamation management. So, what I want to do over the next stretch of time, okay, great, 25 minutes is connect, I have my iPad to the side, is connect two conversations that don't typically happen often in the same room. The demand side conversation we all live in every day. And then the upstream ground level supply conversation that really determines whether or not um, the demand actually gets met. So that's what the next 30 minutes are for. So a little bit more about me. I advise organizations on the electrification economy, energy efficiency, grid resilience, and more now on the energy security implications of critical minerals and infrastructure systems. And I've been tracking a lot of um, impacts of energy demand and the underground construction boom associated with it. So I did my undergrad at University of Richmond studying international business and finance. And as I mentioned, I'm in grad school right now. And the reclamation concentration is not incidental to this talk because it all surrounds energy governance. And um, I'm investigating and have been sitting on it deliberately because I believe that you can't really understand mineral supply risk if we only look at half of the process. And so um, I'm happy and fulfilled in this particular niche of electrification as well as continue to supporting building science and whatnot. So a little bit about the following research is that um, this lives in a project, an initiative that Jake Barnett and I built together, the Critical Inputs Project, housed under AESL. Um, Jake and I applied our perspectives and different angles, materials and energy security, um, and VPPs on both his and my side, more reclamation policy on mine. And the project exists because neither angle alone can truly tell the full story. So um, I share a little bit on there. I won't read through all of that. But one of the thorough line pieces I want to name specifically that I don't want to be ignored is that the central pillar of this is the acknowledgement of the environmental and health impacts of mining these materials. How does this impact communities? How does it impact our energy and water sources? Um, how does this impact generations to come? And this is a governance question, and it is through our approach is woven directly and has increasingly been woven directly into how we're investigating how these supply chains are getting built and whether they can be sustained over time, especially with increased demand. So um, we do original research, policy briefs, public education rather, and we are excited for the future. As mentioned, the Grid Foundry is an advisory firm focused on energy governance, spanning both internal and external organizational strategy across grid reliability, energy efficiency, and the upstream demands of electrification economy. And the specific phrase upstream demand formation, upstream demand of electrification economy is doing a lot of work, and it is the thread that ties this entire talk together. As in addition to my work, it means treating demand not as something that just happens once policy and incentives line up, but also um, something that has to be actively formed against a physical and often constrained supply chain that is so influenced by mild shifts. And with that, and it was wonderful to hear a lot of energy security talk already. So I don't have to speak too much about its history because Sean covered it wonderfully. But what is energy security? And I wanted to ground this in a definition because the term gets thrown around a lot. And I think depending on what sector you're coming from, it can mean different things. But for Grid Foundry, energy security means having reliable access to affordable energy without intense disruptions to supply shocks, geopolitical dependencies. Of course, that's a very blanketed statement, but core infrastructure failures. And for most of the last century, that definition has centered almost entirely on fuel. Like as we heard earlier, could a country secure enough fuel? Could a conflict be started as a result of it, or recently an embargo that cuts off access to it? And that's the version that many of us are like handed by default, and it's incomplete for as we spoke about or heard about earlier, incomplete for where we are now. And so this definition has expanded to cover critical minerals and grid resilience, grid reliability, and demand side pressures. I mean, tied to solar battery storage and other electrification assets and data center growth, especially data center growth. And I think the the expansion isn't finished, and that piece is still missing from a lot of public discussion. And that's why I appreciate being able to speak about it to you guys. And so, what does this look like for electrification? So, as I mentioned, and we spoke about, electrification has redefined what secure actually means. And like with the heating and transportation industry, with since they're all moving into one shared system, the past like century, those were separate risk profiles. And so that has changed. I put older energy security thinking focus, just heating fuel disruption didn't necessarily impact our ability to drive, but transportation fuel disruption doesn't touch our ability to like heat our home. And then the mention of um, demand from electrification data centers specifically, energy demand. And I'm in Virginia personally, Richmond, Virginia, which is slated to be the new global internet hub due to our digital and physical infrastructures. And I mean, we're just 70 miles south of the data center alley that is really redefining what energy affordability means. The recent proposed acquisition between NextEra and Dominion and a lot of other interesting utility updates and energy demand impacts taking place. And I'm involved a lot in that workforce intersection. And with energy demand tripling, I mentioned this last year, energy demand tripling um, by three times in the next 13 and a half, 14 and a half years, that really means that we need to bring up energy security more. So I'll go to the next slide. And here's the piece that I think gets missed often, and what this is the hinge that this talk is like really about. It's the bottleneck that shows up before the grid is necessarily involved. As we heard earlier, every electrified device and like the EVs and heat pumps, as I wrote, depend on materials. And the instinct is to assume that the constraint is the shortage of the raw materials. But again, it's the processing and it's the limited capacity to process them, the step between mining and a usable industrial product or input. And that is an under discussed narrative. And that's also what my graduate school program master's project focuses on. And energy security has to account for that upstream bottleneck directly. And that is why I'm bringing this up to us energy efficiency geniuses and nerds. So, why does this session matter? Electrification runs on hardware, and where that demand actually lands increasingly is dependent on decisions made in Washington right now when this build out is happening. And so I think about this session and the conversation in general in three layers: the build out, the mineral bill, which we'll talk or we'll overview, see time, um, overview copper, uranium, lithium, and rare earths. And then the third layer, policy response, is moving faster than many of us are tracking. And it's incredibly interesting and also overwhelming in a positive way, and closing that gap in understanding, especially for the renewable energy efficiency side, I think is um, important. And so as I mentioned, these are the minerals that basically this table is the foundation of everything that this talk is built on. And copper handles conductivity. And I don't have to go through all of them, but lithium handles storage, uranium um, is under the firm generation front, and then rare earths are the magnetic oriented minerals. There's four minerals and they have distinct roles. And I think this is these are electrification assets as well. When we think of electrification assets, we also have to think about the minerals. And when we think about heat pumps, the components of heat pumps, the main minerals dominant in how these processes expand and develop. Um, this is what we're referring to. We can look at any single asset on a project list and you can trace it back to a few critical minerals at once. And so I think what I want all of us to take from this isn't the specific pairings, because that doesn't necessarily matter in this context. It's just that there are there it's a central component of the work that we're doing, and our our electrification economy, our new energy economy is going to demand way more um, materials than we even think. So copper, a lot of us know this, but for those that want a refresher, copper is the material holding a lot of the electrification build out together, with the windings and the wires and the transformers and the interconnection points. And there's not really a real substitute at scale, but aluminum can get used in certain applications, but that trades efficiency and weight considerations in order to make it a solid swap. And that also gets expensive with grid scale development. But I mentioned the specific concentration of demand because EV wire harnesses alone are on track to pass 1.7 million tons in 6 years. And then with data center transformers, they use around 250 to 300 kilograms of copper per megavolt amp. And that's four times what that's four times what a traditional, um, well, conventional grid transformer needs. And then with lithium, and one thing about copper, I think that it is a critical mineral that we all need to keep our eyes on in this entire conversation, because in part because it's been a part of our grid for well over a century. And with lithium specifically, it helps make intermittent generation behave like firm capacity because of the storage layer. And um, I was going to get into the differences between LFP and NMC batteries, but I don't think that's necessary. But that's all to say, um, lithium ion battery carries around 440 pounds of copper per megawatt on top of its lithium content. And again, when we think about scaling large distributed energy generation and increased battery storage, and yes, there are alternatives, but we really have to think about how much ore gets mined and be aware of it. There are very large estimates for, in general, how much ore gets moved, gets mined globally every year, and it's anywhere from 500 million to a billion tons globally every year, which is a massive amount. And on the uranium front, the US fuel cycle is been across the conversion and the enrichment side, but enrichment is where uh, nuclear advocates see real exposure concentrations. And we have one commercial enrichment plant here in the States, and we don't have the capacity to match demand. And so I wrote here that Russia and China have control roughly 63% of global enrichment capacity. And I put the 2024 ban because um, there's a real deadline attached to the mismatch capacity and demand. And then with rare earths, our final one, um, while rare earths get used in small quantities, as I wrote, um, they are not necessarily low stakes. And I wrote that 80 to 90% of EVs run on rare earth permanent magnets using around a pound and or pardon me, 1.5 kilograms of neodymium iron boron per vehicle. But this adds up, especially with electrification mandates. And um, more, again, this is all to foster more conversation between the minerals and energy sector, because the work that we do is critical in electrification. And even with stalled and halted federal initiatives, the work continues, especially at the local and state level and the code level. Right here, well, I'll actually pull this up first, but this chart is the international IEA's work on critical minerals in the clean energy transition is a part of a big group of graphs. And I encourage us to look at the relative scale between the minerals rather than looking at the specific growth percentages. It's the fastest growing minerals in percentage terms aren't necessarily the ones creating the most exposure for the specific work in the room. And I think the difference between the scale and exposure, those are two different measurements rather, and understanding that is important. And then that I should have put that slide first, but um, the the graph projects mineral demand growth out of 2040 compared to a 2020 baseline. And for anyone running efficiency programs, copper matters more than lithium, even though lithium tends to get more attention because of the battery storage capacity. And then copper, as we know, is pretty embedded. And I wrote here, I think, embedded in most of all measures related to electrification, from heat pump wiring and compressors and panel upgrades and EV charger circuits and interconnection equipment. But the lithium, graphite, cobalt, et cetera, that's mostly a battery and EV story, not necessarily an efficiency program one. And at least as it ties to the energy security bottlenecks, here is essentially the core of everything that we've built towards, with the differences between like importation percentages for, or rather, what percentage of the different rare earths and critical materials are processed by um, other countries, namely China. And then this
Well,
right
just
here,
to
I know.
go back to that, just to understand that that previous graph that's showing us that 91%, 96, 95, and 63% of those are not in the United States,
Yeah,
not being processed.
sorry. Yeah.
Yep,
For example, 91%, it's the percent concentration outside of the United States.
for the refining.
Yeah.
Okay, continue. Sorry, thanks.
Oh, no, no, no. I thank you for I know that I'm running short on time, and I've made far too many slides because I am excited about this topic. But um again, for uranium, one commercial plant here in the United States, limited capacity, and there's a fixed deadline. And then um, with rare earths, as ore gets mined domestically, for example, Mountain Pass MP materials, the actual separation of it happens almost entirely overseas, which is why that the domestic mine hasn't closed the domestic supply gap the way people who don't think about this often have. And there are so many impressive, inspiring people that I learn so much from every other week, that I'm excited to learn more and to contribute more. But this really is an effort across industries, especially now with the energy demand equation brewing. And this, I know I'm wrapping up, but this timeline is to show how, on the federal level, updates and priorities have been made to shape conditions and foster um, environments to allow onshoring, more increased onshoring to happen for certain minerals. And that's mainly tied to the defense industry, even though my priority is energy. And yeah, this could be a much longer timeline. I tried to include some main ones, but in general, electrification work um, sits inside a broader energy security conversation. And this, like, we all speak fluently with loads and performance and adoption. And I think we should be also considering more about supply chain and processing. And the numbers I wrote here, 16, there are 16 critical minerals that we're fully import dependent on, nearly 20%, but 18% of our electricity generation comes from nuclear. And then roughly $185 billion, there are $185 billion in net imports of processed critical minerals last year, which was more than double the year before. I believe it was 78. And in 2024. And that last figure is one to really hold on to because it's a processing number, not just a mining number, and it's compounding quickly. And so we all should think about that. So in general, I'll wrap things up with final slides. Um, I think as it relates to copper and battery, copper in batteries, and how that fuels into the heat pumps, and as I mentioned, the panel upgrades and the storage applications, it's worth tracking. Procurement lead times are as well. In general, projects near new mining or processing investment, if you're interested in more of the adjacent, like interconnection queue related topics. And then we're all tracking program and incentives design, but as I wrote, domestic content and supply chain security, that I would really look out for that. And in general, signals to watch. I I always track these main things in general: copper price index movements, what formerly was um, the loan programs office now is the Office of Energy Dominance Financing. I would track their activity, and I would also follow the utility IRP plans heavily. I do so for many states and have done a lot of more increased utility planning work and energy innovation, heat storage work in the Western states. And to wrap up, the questions that I recommend we all think more about is, are we planning around supply chains that exist today, or the one that we think policies will promise us and hope they exist by the time the project needs it or at scale? And second one is domestic content requirements tighten before the capacity is built, who absorbs that gap? And then when you specify heat pump, are you specifying a technology or a claim on a specific supply chain that this industry doesn't control? So I just keep that in mind. But thank you so much. That is my talk.